Welcome back. In 620 CE, two revolutions changed the face of the Mediterranean world. One was physical, noisy, obvious, and the consequences were short-lived. The other was spiritual, quiet, and the consequences are still with us today. So, by the beginning of the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was still recovering from the plague, which had recurred a couple of times since Justinian's reign. Most of the land recaptured by Justinian was still in the empire, but the grip, in parts, was weakening. The peace Justinian had bought from the Sasanian Empire was over, and conflict again demanded the emperor's attention. Sadly, though, at this point, the emperor wasn't very much interested in that, and his attention was on other things. Phocas had become emperor late in 602, after overthrowing the previous emperor, Maurice. By all accounts, Phocas was not a good emperor, and seemed more interested in rooting out enemies at home than in defeating enemies abroad. The empire lost ground in the north and east, while Phocas parted in Constantinople. The Blues and the Greens, largely quiet since the Nika riots, took this opportunity to settle a few old scores and rioted once again, and this was the final straw for the ruling classes. A rebellion headed by Heraclius the Elder, the governor of Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, advanced on Constantinople. He may have expected Phocas to put up a fight, but instead Heraclius the Elder's son, confusingly also called Heraclius, entered the city with no resistance at all. This was probably because anyone capable of actually putting up a defence had defected to Heraclius' side already. Phocas had managed to alienate the aristocracy, the army, and the people during his reign. Certainly the Blues and the Greens, presumably once they'd run out of scores, united again and joined Heraclius, meaning that Phocas couldn't rally anyone in the city to come to his defence. Phocas was swiftly summoned, appeared, and was immediately executed, along with many of his family and his top officials. Their bodies were paraded through the city and then burned in a public square. Phocas's reign had lasted for only 8 years, but the damage he did to the empire was out of all proportion to the time he spent in the palace. The treasury depleted, the north invaded by Slavs and Avars, the east lost to the Sassanid Persians, and Italy all but lost to the Lombards. In its history so far, Constantinople had never needed a great leader as much as it needed one now. Heraclius had a big challenge ahead of him. Now, following such a terrible emperor, it's no surprise that Heraclius was seen as a literal godsend, but even he couldn't work miracles immediately. The early years of his reign were consumed by political consolidation as he tried to neutralise potential rivals, reconstitute loyal command structures, and generally reorient the imperial bureaucracy towards a more coherent framework. Central to this consolidation was the decision to shift the empire's official language from Latin to Greek, a move with deep symbolic as well as practical consequences. It finally aligned the administration with the demographic and linguistic realities of the empire's eastern provinces. For a long time, the empire's official language was out of step with the language used by many of its constituent countries. Much of the Byzantine Empire's territory, Asia Minor, Greece, Egypt, Syria, had once been ruled by Alexander the Great and his successors. These areas were deeply shaped by Greek culture, language, and administrative traditions. Even though the population and culture were largely Greek, the empire had long governed them using Roman structures. Latin as the official language, Roman law codes, and Roman-style military and bureaucratic organisation. Changing the official language to match the common language was a long overdue realignment, but no longer using the language of Rome was hugely symbolic. Heraclius shifted the empire's identity by making Greek the official administrative language and leaning more openly into Hellenistic traditions of governance. Byzantium stopped ruling Greek lands in a Roman way and began ruling them in a way that matched their cultural roots. And for many, this is the point at which Byzantium becomes a truly Greek empire, rather than just the eastern half of a Roman empire. Before Heraclius, Byzantium was essentially Roman rule imposed on Hellenistic lands. After him, it became a Hellenistic empire with Roman heritage. The strategic signalling of a new era, through language, ceremony and policy, was both a public declaration of intent and a practical reorganisation of power. Immediately, the imperial centre became more credible and more capable of coordinating defence and governance across contested frontiers. With internal legitimacy secured, Heraclius faced the pressing military crisis on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front, long the empire's most exposed boundary, demanded rapid and decisive action as hostile Sasanian and Arab forces tested imperial resolve. The challenge was not only to repel incursions, but to preserve the empire's core population and revenue base, which were increasingly under threat from long sieges and raiding parties. Military leaders had to adjust to new challenges: wide and scattered borders, fewer soldiers, and the need to move forces quickly. Campaigns from this era show a shift towards asymmetric warfare, where the Byzantine Empire relied on fast-moving field armies and strong fortresses to slow enemy advances while protecting its economy. To support this strategy, the government introduced new logistical methods, such as supplying troops by sea, maintaining long supply lines through contested regions, and using naval forces to cut off enemy shipments that kept besieged provinces alive. Military results varied across different regions, but the overall strategy was cautious and deliberate, holding the line, preventing collapse, and waiting for conditions to improve. Heraclius focused on resilience, flexibility, and securing key fortresses that served as anchors of imperial defence. The empire's defence was tightly linked to its economy. Taxes, revenue collection, and requisitioning all had to be adjusted so that long campaigns could be sustained without destabilising the provinces. A major challenge in his early reign was the fragile state of the economy, made worse by the loss of Egypt to the Sassanids. Egypt had been the empire's main source of grain, and its capture threatened more than famine. It endangered city populations, disrupted army supplies, and undermined the ability to pay soldiers. To cope, the government reshaped its tax system, sought out new grain sources, and redirected funds to strengthen frontier fortifications and supply networks. Tax may not feel like a very interesting topic, but this period emphasises the very real problem of sustaining a war economy under severe resource constraints. Wars are expensive. No money, no war, and unpaid soldiers are a dangerous enemy for any emperor to make. Heraclius' financial reforms also required reorganising the bureaucracy to stop corruption, improve oversight, and make sure tax systems could fund a long war without sparking unrest. This tension between money and military reflects a central theme of his early rule: building institutions that could survive under pressure, balancing urgent military demands with the longer-term stability of the empire. To cope, Heraclius had to manage resources more carefully and encourage a spirit of shared sacrifice across society, reminding both rich and poor that survival depended on unity. In other words, we are all in it together. Aside from Egypt, though, there was another loss that was to become a watershed moment for the Byzantine state. In 614, after a long siege, the Sasanian army captured Jerusalem, sacking the city, massacring portions of its population, and seizing the True Cross and other sacred relics. The news sent shockwaves through the Christian world, undermining morale in Constantinople and challenging the empire's capacity to project religious and political legitimacy. The event punctured any sense of inevitable Byzantine ascendancy, highlighting the vulnerability of a vast, multi-front empire. The immediate Byzantine response was one of urgent mobilization, with renewed appeals to frontier commanders, a reorganization of military and fiscal resources, and a public narrative that sought to frame the loss within a larger providential arc, one that could be reversed through steadfast leadership, disciplined administration, and a renewed offensive in Persian-held territories. But despite that, the psychological blow remained acute. Jerusalem, the theological heart of the empire, was no longer under imperial control, and the symbolism of the cross had been desecrated, creating a very real sense of vulnerability among both clergy and the laity. The longer-term reception in the capital and across the provinces layered the initial alarm with a stubborn resolve to reconstitute imperial power through reform, resource allocation, and a deliberate reassertion of religious and political authority in the wake of this disaster. This dual emotional and strategic response, grief and resolve, defined Byzantine attitudes towards Jerusalem's loss and helped Heraclius' subsequent campaigns to recover the city and restore sanctified symbols of the imperial state. During the later years of Heraclius' war with Persia, the northern front remained intensely active, even as his focus increasingly shifted towards the recapture of Jerusalem. Byzantine command recalibrated its northern and eastern efforts to prevent a collapse of provincial control and to prepare for a broader counteroffensive. While Heraclius oriented the main strategic thrust towards the eastern frontier and the eventual reconquest of the Near East, the northern front, where attacks by Persian allied forces and shifting border pressures continued, didn't lapse into inactivity. Instead, it operated as a theatre of attrition and reconnaissance, with frontier commanders striving to hold key passes, secure supply lines, and prevent the emergence of a durable Persian foothold in the Caucasus and Armenia. The empire's leadership recognized that victory couldn't be secured by a single decisive stroke. Instead, it required a layered defence in the north while simultaneously building the capabilities and morale needed for a prolonged multi-year campaign. By 615, the internal and external pressures that had defined the early years of Heraclius' reign began to show the first signs of stabilisation, even as the empire remained besieged on multiple fronts. Heraclius' reforms allowed the empire to begin reversing some of the losses suffered. This reflects something significant about the early years of Heraclius' leadership. Despite spectacular military reversals and stunning losses at times, the empire emerged with a reorganized state capable of withstanding continued pressure and ready to embark on a broader counteroffensive in the ensuing decade. During the mid to late 620s, Heraclius pursued a sweeping year-by-year counteroffensive that leveraged the empire's reorganized administration, mobilized manpower, and reimagined war economy. This period saw sustained campaigning across Armenia, the Caucasus, and the border zones, with victories confirming imperial legitimacy and enabling a gradual reoccupation of terrain previously lost to Persian forces. The northern front couldn't be ignored. It was still a crucial staging ground for these offensives and a bastion against renewed Persian pressure that could threaten Constantinople and the heartland. But the dual dynamic, defence on the northern periphery and a protracted mobile war machine in the east, meant the empire was effectively fighting on two frontiers, albeit with a different tempo and emphasis, something that military strategists will usually tell you is not a very good idea. So, even as Jerusalem occupied the imperial imagination as the ultimate prize, the northern front was still this persistent, grinding concern that shaped decisions about manpower allocation, fortification strategy, and the sequencing of offensives that would eventually anchor Heraclius' broader success. By the late 620s, momentum, logistics, and political legitimacy all came together into a decisive realization. Heraclius had recaptured Egypt in 628, and the empire was now prepared to retake Jerusalem. The recapture of the city in 629 symbolized not merely a military reversal, but the restoration of imperial authority and religious symbolism, something that had been severely damaged by repeated defeats. In the aftermath, the imperial narrative would emphasize the restoration of order, the reunification of provinces, and the reassertion of faith and governance under Heraclius, a return to the normal order of things. The city's recapture also meant regaining control over the True Cross, a potent emblem of legitimacy and divine favour for the emperor's rule. It also reinforced the perception that the Byzantine state could recover from catastrophic losses through disciplined leadership, strategic patience, and a reorganized war economy, validating Heraclius' reformist project by demonstrating that real and lasting success could be achieved. The triumph would also shape religious and cultural narratives within the empire, strengthening the prestige of Constantinople and emboldening the empire's ability to project power into contested holy sites. In this sense, Jerusalem's recovery was the capstone of Heraclius' early period, a culmination of reformist governance. Records of Heraclius' personal life are a bit scarce, but there are some things we know. His marriage history is particularly interesting. After his accession, he married Eudokia. They had been betrothed, kind of like being engaged, years earlier when Heraclius had been fighting in North Africa. Phocas's brutal rule had alienated many groups, including the factions. The Blues had traditionally been closer to imperial power, so the Greens, who had previously been marginalised, saw Heraclius as a chance to restore some influence. By securing Greens' support, Heraclius ensured that one of the city's most powerful popular groups would welcome him. The Greens had strong ties to sailors and dockyard workers, and they provided manpower, ships and provisions, helping Heraclius assemble the naval force that carried him to Constantinople. Their backing gave his rebellion legitimacy and practical strength. They also helped him out on a more personal level. During Heraclius' campaign to seize Constantinople, Eudokia and Heraclius' mother Epiphania were captured by Phocas and held as hostages. They were rescued by members of the Green faction, which enabled Heraclius to continue with his assault on the capital. Eudokia died in 612 and was a very popular empress. The public's grief turned to outrage when Heraclius remarried less than a year later to his niece, Martina. Despite the church seeing this relationship as incestuous and being personally opposed to it, Patriarch Sergius I conducted the ceremony himself, and Martina was then immediately crowned as Augusta. This second marriage was not only a dynastic alliance, but also a source of significant political tension, which had lasting repercussions for court politics and for perceptions of imperial legitimacy among the elites and the clergy. Contemporary and later writers often framed Martina's influence over imperial policy and court life as a destabilizing factor. Regardless of whether this is actually true or not, Martina did play a prominent role in the governance of the empire. Across Constantinople and the surrounding provinces, the marriage was widely unpopular from the start due to the sense that it contravened canonical norms and contemporary expectations about dynastic propriety. Clerical voices, especially the higher clergy, expressed skepticism or outright disapproval, framing the marriage as a breach of ecclesiastical law and a serious moral misstep that threatened the spiritual legitimacy of Heraclius' reign. The combination of ecclesiastical disapproval and popular hostility intensified the sense that the throne was compromised by personal indiscretion, even as Heraclius governed through crisis and reform abroad. But not everybody felt the same way. Within certain circles at court and among some segments of the aristocracy who benefited from her proximity to the emperor, Martina's influence was seen as a practical partnership that helped sustain imperial resolve during the empire's hour of greatest peril. In public ceremonies and triumphs, Martina's status as Augusta and her visibility alongside Heraclius reinforced the perception of a dynastic, legitimate rule, even if this legitimacy was contested in doctrinal and popular terms. Skipping ahead a little, when Heraclius died in 641, he left the throne to Heraclius Constantine, his son from his first marriage, and Heraclonus, his son by Martina, both as co-emperors. Martina, as empress, tried to act as regent and assert influence over both, but her regency was unpopular, with many in Constantinople still resenting her marriage to Heraclius. A few months after Heraclius' death, Heraclius Constantine died suddenly and unexpectedly. Rumours inevitably spread that Martina and her allies poisoned him to secure power for Heraclonus, making the public even angrier and fatally undermining her legitimacy as empress and regent. The army moved against her, and the Senate and the general public demanded the elevation of Constans II, the son of Heraclius Constantine, as emperor, totally sidelining Martina and Heraclonus, who were accused of treason and misrule. They were seized, and Martina's tongue was cut out while Heraclonus' nose was slit, traditional Byzantine mutilations to make them unfit to rule, and both of them were exiled to Rhodes, stripped of all power and titles. All this took place in less than a year, and what happened to Martina after her exile isn't known. She disappears from the records, and unlike some exiled royals who staged comebacks, Martina never again reappears in Byzantine politics. Most historians believe she remained in Rhodes until her death, living quietly without political influence, although some scholars suggest she may not have lived long, given the trauma of mutilation, the loss of status, and harsh conditions of exile. While Heraclius had been seizing power in Constantinople and changing the empire's army and administration to combat the Persian threat, another threat was quietly forming to the south in Arabia. In 610, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was meditating in a cave outside of Mecca. Muhammad was a merchant of the Quraysh tribe and had a reputation for honesty. In that cave, he experienced his first revelations, which he proclaimed as messages from God. These revelations, later compiled into the Quran, called for strict monotheism, moral reform, and social justice. His message challenged the entrenched polytheism and economic interests of Mecca's elite, leading to growing hostility towards him and his followers. Persecution in Mecca forced Muhammad and his community to seek refuge elsewhere. In 622, while Heraclius was embarking on a decisive 6-year campaign against the Persians, his community migrated to Medina in an event known as the Hijra, which became the foundational moment of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, Muhammad assumed both spiritual and political leadership, forging a new kind of community, the Ummah, defined by faith rather than tribal ties. This transformation gave Islam a political dimension, enabling it to expand beyond Mecca's boundaries. Over the next decade, Muhammad consolidated his authority through both diplomacy and conflict. In 628, while Heraclius is concluding his peace treaty with Persia and celebrating the recapture of Jerusalem, Mecca recognized the Muslims as a legitimate religious community, allowing them to re-enter the city. In 630, Muhammad entered Mecca and established it as the spiritual center of Islam. By the time of his death in 632, much of Arabia had accepted Islam, either through persuasion or political alliance. Muhammad's death didn't halt the momentum of the new faith. Leadership passed to Abu Bakr, the first caliph, who suppressed tribal revolts and unified Arabia under Islam. Now they were ready to expand beyond the peninsula. Under the second caliph, Umar, Muslim armies began campaigns into neighbouring empires. By the mid-630s, they confronted the Byzantine Empire directly, with the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 marking the first major clash between Islam and Byzantium and the beginning of Islam's transformation from a regional Arabian movement into a world power. It was a clash that Byzantium decisively lost, and it wouldn't be the last. Heraclius' final years were shaped by a constant negotiation between recovering a throne won through force and facing a world that would soon redefine its borders and centre of gravity. After a long arc of reform, mobilization and strategic counteroffensives that restored much of the Eastern Front and reasserted imperial authority, the emperor's health and political leverage were gradually declining. He spent his last years overseeing his succession arrangements, most notably the complex dynamics involving his son and co-emperors, the lingering influence of Martina, and the fragile balance of power at the capital. In this period, the empire's attention began to pivot from not only surviving the Persian threat, but also preparing for a new era, where the rising power of the Islamic Caliphate would redraw the map of the eastern and southern frontiers. This transition intensified the sense that even masterful crisis management couldn't fully shield Byzantium from what was coming. Heraclius died in February 641 of old age, having sat on the throne for 30 years. By the end of the 640s, substantial provinces, most notably Egypt and Syria, had fallen or were under sustained Muslim control, constraining Byzantium's economic base and strategic depth. The rapid rise of Islam presented an external threat unlike anything Byzantium had faced before. Heraclius was a transformative ruler, though his success was mixed. He achieved a dramatic turnaround against Persia and introduced reforms that strengthened the empire's central administration. By the end of his reign, Byzantium was more unified, more Greek in identity, and better able to fight large-scale wars. But these changes also made the empire more fragile. The new centralized system meant that losing a key province, like Egypt, the empire's main source of grain, could destabilize everything. The government was stronger in theory, but less flexible in practice. Byzantium could sustain long campaigns, but it struggled to adapt quickly to sudden crises. Heraclius left behind an empire that was resilient in the short term, but vulnerable in the long term. Over-centralization, dependence on Egypt, and rigid military structures left Byzantium exposed to the upheavals of the mid to late 7th century, particularly the Arab conquests that reshaped the eastern Mediterranean. It's fair to say that Heraclius saved Byzantium from the imminent collapse in the short term and established the conditions for a prolonged endurance, but the long-term survival of Byzantium depended on continued innovation by his successors in the face of this persistent external threat. But they were not up to the task. Over the next 80 years, Byzantium was to face one of the most turbulent periods in its history. A succession of weak, reluctant or despotic rulers, the loss of Egypt, Syria and much of North Africa, and a siege of Constantinople that lasted for 4 years, all left the empire battered, bruised, but still standing. Ready for our next emperor, Leo III, the man who stabilized and reformed the empire, but sparked one of Byzantium's longest and most divisive theological conflicts, one that was to divide the empire for 100 years. Join me next time for that, but for now, thank you very much for listening. Please remember to like, share and subscribe on your way out, and until next time, whatever you're up to, have a great day.